Okay. Well, thank you all for giving us a part of your Thursday here to sit in on TrenData's monthly webinar series. Today's webinar is entitled How HR Can Turn Big Data into Predictive Analytics. I'm going to start off, just give a little agenda of what we're going to cover today. I'll give everybody a brief overview of who TrenData is presenting the webinar today, but that's the minimal part of the webinar. And then we can dive right into the topic at hand and talk about, what is big data, and particularly how it relates to HR. We'll talk about formal definitions, different types of big data, and then we'll walk through what's been commonly espoused throughout the industry. What are the 5 V's of big data? We'll talk about those in general, and then zero in on how each of them apply to HR and the kind of data that all of you deal with on a daily basis. Then we'll move into what type of technology is out there to actually assist you in turning this big data into valuable projections and information for your company. And we'll do this by demonstrating the TrenData People Analytics solution. We've left some time at the end of the presentation for questions. If you have a question during the presentation and you don't want to forget it or whatever, just use the chat facility within GoToMeeting and send a private chat to Steve Parda, and he'll assemble the questions and ask them. If we get to the end of the presentation, that's when you're amended, just send the chat in and we'll cover it. But want to make sure that during the presentation, if you want to cover something, you can communicate it right away. So, okay, so let's dive in. First off, talk a little bit about TrenData. TrenData is a cloud-based software provider of advanced and predictive analytics. We do this by bringing together large sums of data, big or small, from whatever repositories you have in your organization. The kind of the common ones in HR are HRIS systems, talent systems, payroll systems, but we're not limited to those. We can bring in financial data or anything that's in an ERP system. We can build a direct connection to our system and give you the ability to mine that data to not only do current analytics on and trends on what's going on within your organization, but also use this to do predictive analytics and forecast into the future. What are the best decisions you can make going forward to optimize the performance of your workforce? TrenData, our headquarters, is located in Plano, Texas. If any of you have had the opportunity to come down to Dallas, you're probably familiar with where Plano is. We're just the next city north of Dallas, a growing suburb city of its own, but considered part of the DFW Metroplex. So if you fly into Dallas, very easy to get to Plano. The founders of the company are myself. I'm the CEO, Tom McEwen. My co-founder is the advisory chairman, Mon Hamden. You may know Mon from his past role. He founded a very successful talent management company, HR Smart, and that's actually where the majority of our executive team comes from. So we all have, 10 to 15 years of really deep HR experience in both software and domain of HR. So we have a good body here for you to check in with and, bounce questions and get solutions on, what you're addressing on a daily basis. We've got a pretty diverse customer base. It goes across all industries. So, if you're looking at doing something with TrenData, we can always get you references from whatever industry you're in to, talk about the general problems. Okay, enough of the commercial. Let's dive in and talk about big data. So there's a lot of definitions out there, but I kind of liked this one, particularly as it applies to people in HR. But TechTarget is a very renowned technology service agency, and I like their definition the best, particularly from that second word, evolving. I think the term big data has kind of changed a little since it first hit the scenes, 4 or 5 years ago. But their definition is, it's an evolving term that describes, voluminous, very large amounts of data in structured, semi-structured, and unstructured form. But the real key there is the bolded underlined part, is that data has the potential to be mined for information. You could probably also put in there mined for valuable revenue producing, cost saving, productivity information that you can use going forward to better run your workforce and your organization. Now, it talks about the 3 different types of data there, and we'll kind of cover them one at a time. Probably the kind of data that you're most familiar with in human resources is structured data. It's data that's been organized in some fashion into a formatted repository. A formatted repository is pretty typically a database. So probably, most of the information you're dealing with or want to make use of is in a database. But you can also consider, structured flat files are also structured data. Anything that's in a CSV or an Excel spreadsheet is also considered structured data because it's very easily, it's not very easily, it is actually contained in records, so you can very easily upload it into a system of such. You contrast that with unstructured data that you might be dealing with, and that's more of the free form, free text kind of information. It might be Word documents or emails that you're trying to glean information out of that don't have any really kind of structure. You might also be dealing with data that are, either photos or videos even to bring into your system. And also, as we keep evolving, there might be a place for voice as well. So this is all sorts of data that's out there, but in its unstructured format, it's very tough to crunch like you would structured data. But kind of the middle ground between those two, semi-structured data, actually takes unstructured data and puts associations in it, whether it's metadata or tags or whatever. So you can, in some fashion, glean the data and get some productive information out of it. Example is, how things are tagged or hyperlinked either within, web pages or within documents. You can take a Word document and hyperlink the document or meta tag it. So this gives you some ability to take unstructured data and put it into a format where it can be used. But it's still not as useful as structured data because, again, it's not in that record format where it can be crunched on, from the get-go. But that's a way to take unstructured data and, make it a little more useful. So the 5 V's of big data that make big data something to of a terminology and a useful practice, and we'll go through them one at a time. The first one, which is mostly illustrated a little bit by this diagram here, is variety. That refers to not only different sources of data, but different types of data. So again, being able to bring in information from multiple sources and also crunch together, whether it's financial, people data, and other types of maybe social media data that you might want to bring in and be able to harvest. The second V, veracity, has really 2 meanings. The first is the one you're probably most familiar is the data accurate. So you might have data that's been put into a system that's either output in the wrong cell, or it's old data that hasn't been updated, or incorrectly entered data. But the other side of veracity is it truthful data? You don't probably deal with this one as much, but on social media, libelous claims that are made out by people could also be considered part of big data. Also, fraudulent information that might be used for criminal motives can also be considered the veracity of data. Volume, of course, large amounts of data, but also, again, data that comes from a variety of sources and may still have those connections. So it might be one database pulling from another database, pulling from another database, and a lot of interconnections. but generally that refers to just a really large amount of data. The next one is key, the velocity of the data. That refers to how quickly the data is being updated, changed, or augmented. So as you are working with this large amount of data, what's the staticness of it versus is it always being changed, always, and you have to capture snapshots of it very frequently and very often to get the right read out of it. And then the final V, which is actually the bridge from big data to analytics, is value. Can you mine this big mobile multi type of database into something that's going to help your organization move forward and basically make money out of it? So let's kind of take these 5 V's and look at them and how they interact and how they apply to HR. Now, I do put as often as possible in my presentations, I like to be able to source information, but this 5 V's has been around for a long time, and I had a real tough time trying to find who the original author is. There's been articles by IBM, McKinsey, a couple of notable people, but every time I find someone who I think is the first, I find an earlier version. So right now I don't know who's the original source of these 5 V's, but it's very prevalent out there when talking about big data. So let's look at the first one, variety, and talk about how that works with HR. As in the original diagram of what TrenData does, really where variety comes into play in HR is the multiple sources. The data is mostly structured that you're dealing with, whether it's coming from some type of HR system, an HRIS system, a talent system, a payroll system. The data at least is in some structured format as it's coming into the system when it comes from when it's coming from one of those systems. Very often, data resides for HR is also in flat file format. Whether that's a spreadsheet, a CSV. As we've worked with a lot of our clients and prospects, we find that there is still a significantly large amount of information that's in flat file format that organizations wish to mine and get information out of it. Now, there is some unstructured data out there, which companies still need to get access to and to glean information from. There's probably still a formidable amount of companies out there in the small and mid-market who are doing their performance reviews on kind of printed Word documents where the manager goes through it, puts it out, and then submits the final document to HR. In some instances, there's a lot of individual ad hoc feedback on personnel that comes in the form of emails that might be tied on as notes into a system, which is in an unformatted area. This third one probably doesn't relate as much to what you're trying to crunch when doing forecasting and reporting, but learning content. So you've got learning management, which is the formal tracking of career advancement, but a lot of the associated content, whether it's YouTube videos or online tests and stuff, might be considered an unstructured format. But I'd say that's probably mostly the minority as far as HR is confirmed. I think the real variety is multiple structured formats. From a veracity issue, as I kind of hinted to in talking about the overall, most of the issues of veracity with HR data have to do with clean data. Data using the left side where someone's either misentered the data or the data hasn't been updated, the employee has moved or is in a different position or whatever, and that data coming out of your system just isn't upgraded, and it's not accurate from that standpoint, or it's coming from multiple systems. You might have different employee IDs that have to be put over, but it's mainly a maintenance issue as opposed to, I'd say, a fraudulent issue. Someone using a technology platform to badmouth somebody or to break into a system to get stuff out of it, whereas you might have, you know, maybe in a banking or a credit card business where, you know, there are attempts at fraud and that has to be dealt with. Mainly the issue of veracity in HR has to do with the cleanliness and the accuracy of the data, not really the fraudulent part or the nature of it. Volume, I know it might seem unmanageable at times, but comparatively, the amount of data that HR has to deal with from a sheer size is more manageable than some of your other departments, whether it's sales or financial, mainly in the fact that your ERP systems, you know, do a good job of collecting it into, again, structured formats. And if you output your all of your employee records into a spreadsheet, probably would only be a couple of megabytes, but in its specified format inside your HRIS and stuff, it's probably more in the terms of gigabytes. And you compare that to, say, you know, Amazon or, you know, one of these other big companies. You know, Amazon, this was a stat from about 3 or 4 years ago, their entire customer base was 42 terabytes of information. So that's 1,000 gigabytes, a large amount of information. But there's two types of big data that HR generally deals with. There's the internal collecting of your own employee records and information. And then there's external data that you might be importing into your system. This can take a number of forms. It might be data services that you import either for benefits. You might import information, say, we'll show a little bit of this, surveys to compare what's going on in your company with outside companies, not with companies in your industry. For example, you may be paying your people at a certain level, but you want to import industry salary data from salary.com or Mercer or somebody to see if you're paying consistent in the industry for various positions. So those are external big data sources where you'd be pulling that into your environment to do comparisons. A lot of what's done in the pre-hire phase in hiring people has access to various large big data sources. So if you're pulling information into your recruiting system, you're often dealing with very large big data sources such as job boards, candidate pools of information and stuff, where you're interacting your system with these outside sources of big data and pulling pieces of information in to help run your business better. Again, the nice thing about this is, you know, these services often as well are very structured so that their import into your system can be done in a rather organized fashion. You know, it might be a situation where you download the data first, put it in the right format, and then import it into your system. But those things can be set up automatically, you know, if you're doing this on an ongoing basis, which is often the case with recruiting, so that it's updated on a real-time basis and not just constantly brought down and file uploaded. The good thing about the HR data, particularly, is the deep history that most organizations have. HRIS systems have been around since the early 90s, so most mid to large size companies probably have 5 to 10 years at least worth of employee data. And even systems, organizations that didn't get to an HRIS as soon have usually kept their employee data in some format so that it can be used. It might have been through your payroll system. Most companies don't do their own payroll, so you might be able to have, you know, 5, 10 years worth of ADP data or someone else if you were using for payroll. So you do have that large history of data that you can then, you know, use to find out, you know, what's been going on in your organization as far as workforce trends and movement. So I think it's a manageable amount of data, but in most instances, HR has a very good historic foundation for data. Velocity of data, by comparison, HR's velocity of data tends to be a little slower than normal. And what I mean is really how often the information gets added, augmented and such. For example, most of the updating of an HR system has to do with either hires or terminations. Those tend to be going on all the time. Once a company reaches a certain size, you're generally hiring people every month and terminating people, or having people just leave the company to go to other opportunities. And that's where the majority of the update of the system, and that could be every day of the month. HR Smart, I talk about prior, we had 5 modules of talent management, and the one that was constantly going all the time, as wouldn't surprise you, is the recruiting module. Companies just were on that thing every minute of every day, processing, evaluating, and doing all sorts of recruiting. But then, of course, also in your systems, when someone leaves, you have to document that so it's not fouling up your data. As far as people in the life cycle of the employee experience, things like performance scores and salary increases don't get updated more than a couple of times a year. The other example would be if someone is promoted or transferred around the organization, you have to update their information. I say, again, comparison to other types of big data, Facebook, this was again a couple of years old, but Facebook has 5 billion likes per day on their system. So that's a lot of processing power just to keep up with that. But when we talk about, kind of the slower velocity of data in HR, I always like to ask the question, does it have to necessarily be that slow? Is there a way that you can get more speed and quants of information into your HR system that can give you a better trending mechanism to see what's going on? A lot of companies are heavily invested right now in employee engagement. And a big part of that is sending out pulse surveys all the time to your employees, getting an idea, do they like this particular policy? Are they happy in their job? Would they rather be doing it this way, flex time, or working from home? So this gives HR organizations the opportunity to put more factors of information in there to get a better buzz on what's going on in their organization. Also having the ability to track productivity perhaps on a more month-to-month or real-time scale as opposed to just annually might be a good for salespeople get tracked very granularly, but are there ways to do that with other positions that can give you, again, more quants as far as performance? One thing we've seen a lot of companies doing is updating certain things that, again, involve the employees' abilities to do their job better or work better. Companies track the amount of the length of commute their employees have to do every day, and they actually monitor it by the gas prices and are able to see if your average employee has a 25 to 50 mile commute every day, what does a 10 cents increase in gas prices do to that employee's engagement, possibility of leaving the company and retention score and stuff like that? How's that affected? And that's something that goes on a regular basis. And we talked about productivity and incentive compensation. Can you put more employees on incentive compensation and get an idea of how that's motivating them more on a more frequent basis than is currently measured inside your HR systems? So velocity is a big one. The final V, again, the bridge, the value. Is there value in mining of course there's value in mining all these big data sources that you have in HR. Just the 3 big ones, being able to find, use historical data to find where have you gotten your best hires in the past, and spending more of your focus and resources into going after those sources to get future employees. Also, how can you engage and get optimal productivity out of your employees, whether it's compensation, work-life balance, job and career training? Are those things that make your employees more productive? And then again, preventing turnover, and specifically high performer turnover. There may be what's considered good attrition of people leaving the company, but really what you want to be able to zoom in on is those high performers in your organization, and make sure that you're not building up a superstar that's going to get wooed away to another company for a better package, title, or whatever. And the way to do this is, using that history of information to be able to predictively forecast in the future. If my turnover is going in this direction, if I change something, will it make it come back to the level that has a real effect on business? And then also being able to align those moves to dollars, so that you can talk to your CFO and your CEO and say, yes, we were able to do this. It might have been an investment of X numbers of dollars, but the revenue increase and the cost savings to the company are 100-fold of what we spent. So absolutely being able to take all that historical data, put predictive scenarios in place, and then tie those to revenue are very key. And that's where technology or a solution comes into play, as far as how can you help on that. It's very difficult. If I look at the first bullet, it's very difficult to take a 400-page spreadsheet and look at it and see what the trends are, what's going on within the organization. So being able to put that into some sort of a system and visualize the results so that they're very obvious to the naked eye, whether it's yours, your CEO, or your CFO's, is very key. Also being able to drill down into subgroups, knowing that your turnover rate is 10% company-wide is great, but if it's 30% in Europe and 2% everywhere else, maybe you don't have to prescribe some kind of remedy to the whole company. It might be something you can target right at a particular group. Also being able to, in trending that information, being able to tie certain events together. If productivity started to go down at a certain point, was there a certain event that happened at that time? Did we change our benefits policy? Was an acquisition announced? What are things that cause and effect that we can be able to see more in a single dashboard view than as far as trying to recall that from memory and look at like I say, a spreadsheet output. And then the important part, the modeling of the scenarios. Okay, well, we know this has happened in the past. What if we try these scenarios based on the trends going into the future? Is this going to change things? And being able to model things out. So all very key as far as being able to move forward and mine that data. So at this point, I am going to just jump out of the PowerPoint for a second and move over to the TrenData dashboard. So essentially here we have a login screen to a people analytics system that's dealing with a rather large amount of employees, a company of about 17,000 employees. And you can see there's a number of different metrics on the screen here. Number of employees, revenue per employee, time to fill open positions, average tenure, turnover, salary, source of hire. There's a number of others we have over in the side dashboards, succession planning and others. You can keep those over to the side, or if you wanted to go and add those to your main dashboard, you can do that simply by going into, say, cost per hire. And if you wanted to add that, you would just simply click the plus button, and that would add that to the main dashboard. And then you can kind of move things around to whatever space you want. But I'm just going to focus on those that I have on the main dashboard right now. This data is being updated monthly, but you do have the ability to do real-time feeds, and I'll get into the data sources in a minute here. But this is all the information that was updated as the last upload. If I wanted to go back and see snapshots of prior time periods, like what did things look like in September, I just click on that and it'll go back and show me different information back at that time period. Sticking on the current month, what I have here is every metric is what we call a snapshot in time. It's the information as of that time period. So as of the end of February, we had 17,300 employees. Basing off our revenue, we've got a nice revenue per employee, 346,000. So you can see people leaving would have an effect on that. So let's first look at the three options underneath each metric. We've got a drill down, which will let you go a little deeper on each metric. So let's look at the drill down of the employees here. So I've got 17,000 employees in total in my organization. I could tell by this drill down, I've got roughly 1/3 female, 2/3 male. This is looking at them in raw numbers. So if I wanted to look at them in percentages, I could do that as well. I can also look at other breakdowns as far as where are they located by state, for example. And as I can see, I've got them spread across the globe, but certain pockets of large employee populations in various areas. I might also want to look at them by department again, and it'll break down where you have most of your employees in this company. Then most of them are in operations. So again, a good way to drill down on your organization and to see what's looking. Down below, we have an employee view that would allow you to look at each employee, look at all the records. If you wanted to output this to a CSV file, you can do that. You can also manage what columns you want to look at. If you wanted to move certain ones over to the left, you can do that as well, or take ones off. I'll show that a little bit more as I go into a more filtered view. So let me go back to the dashboard and look at another metric, one that I referenced in the presentation, source of hire. So down here we've got, again, where did all my employees come from in last month's recruiting? See, most of them came from job boards, some came from LinkedIn and other sources. If I go to that second button underneath, this gives me the trended analytics, or the history of where these people have come from. And it'll give it to me in kind of an extended view over the last year as a default. And you can see January, the last year of turnover in different colored graphs, where looks like I've been getting most of my employees from job boards. Again, if I wanted to look even further back, I can, again, change this to percentage. It's going to be pretty large numbers. And look back over 5 years. And over that 5-year period, what I'm going to see, again, is job boards have been my biggest source of hires within my company. But have they been the best employees? That's a good question. So what I can do then is go and filter by any one of a number of factors. So I've got employees that have been having performance reviews over the last 4 to 5 years. So if I go into the performance filter, I can trim down and look at just employees who've scored the highest levels of 4 and 5 and see how that affects things. That takes things to a little bit of a different picture. It shows in the last 2 years that my best employees who've scored high performance ratings have come from LinkedIn and employee referrals, as opposed to job boards, which have been giving my greatest number, have actually been giving a very low number of best employees. So maybe going into the future, I might want to look at accelerating employee referral bonuses and concentrate maybe more of my dollars for recruiting to LinkedIn as opposed to job boards. And then as I go back down to here, you can see it's slimmed out all of my performance metrics by performance rating. And then if I want to add that performance rating to the grid, I can do that. I can save it for just this grid, or if I wanted this same view to be everywhere, I can do that. But I'll just save it for this grid right now. And what that's going to do is then add the performance scores to this grid as well. So moving forward, I talked a little bit about external data sources and being able to import those into the system. And as you can see here, I've also got a metric for average salary. So average salary across the organization right now is about $138,000. I might think that is pretty good pay for my employees. As a CEO myself, I would say, oh, I'm paying my employees pretty well. But you see there's also a space there if I wanted to compare it to some industry salary information. So what I can do is go out and this is in a manual format right now, but I'm going to go and grab a file that has some information from salary.com in it and bring that into my system and see how I'm paying my people and how that stacks up versus the rest of the industry. And we don't we allow you to use salary.com, Mercer. There's a number of different surveys out there, and what you can do is, I'll show you in a second, you can either set up a direct connection to that data, or you could actually do an FTP file transfer. I think salary.com pretty much delivers that data to you in some kind of structured type format. And just before I go back and show that, you can see in our data sources, we can set up direct connections to pretty much any data source out there. These are just a few samples that I've mentioned, but we can bring direct data in, or we can bring it in through various file formats. So if I go back to my dashboard, I will see that it's brought in the salary.com information, and actually it looks like I'm doing pretty well. Of all my positions together, looks like the averages that I'm paying my people is pretty consistent with the industry. If I do a drill down on that and look at it by a couple of different views, it might show me some anomalies, but let's go through and maybe look at it by department. And what that's showing me is, it looks like across departments I'm paying my people pretty well. It looks like I'm paying myself a little better. The CEO is really the only one who's got a little bit more than the rest of the organization. But it pretty much shows me that I'm paying my people pretty consistent with the industry. So that's good to know as I'm going forward. So the next metric trend I want to show, and this is where we're going to bring in the predictive notion, is turnover. So in this current time period, it looks like my turnover is pretty high. That's 5.2% of the entire company is turned over in the 1 month of February. If you annualize that, that means I'm looking at turning over about 60% of my population. Let's see what's going on there. So let's first jump to the analytics view, and it'll show me, again, similar to the source of hire, where my turnover has been going. And as I can see, it looks like it has been on a steady increase since the beginning of the year, really starting maybe in the fall time frame. I'll switch that again to percentage to see if I've been adding employees maybe, but no, it still looks like there's a pretty steep incline where I'm going from over here, it's about less than 2% to the 5.2%. That's a big increase in turnover. I talked a little bit about equating events and trends. So did anything happen in this time period when I had this strict uptick? I can go to my events overlay, and what it's going to tell me, back in the fall of last year, we acquired a company, Acme, and so not surprisingly, that's when turnover started ticking up. Often employees correctly or incorrectly assume that an acquisition might mean layoffs either for the acquired company or the acquirer. So it's a big company. Have we done anything similar to this in the past? So let me go back and see, again, over the past 5 years, what my turnover situation has been. Again, it's going to show, okay, there's a spike where in 2015, I had an increase in turnover that really spiked up from the year before. Again, I can bring in my events overlay and see if that equates to anything. And we did an acquisition back then, another company, and that brought a little bit of fear in, and we had a high turnover. I can also see that we did put in some organizational initiatives after that. We increased our average raise that year so that we'd be 2% above the cost of living. We instituted a telecommuting policy as well as a management training program, and that did seem to have an effect. The turnover did go back down the next year and is spiking up again with this acquisition. So that gives me a little intelligence going forward as to what the sources of this increased turnover might be. So let me flip now to my predictive view. And what it's going to do is tell me, based on that past information, what maybe the future is looking at. So you can see the upward trend that we were talking about later, and it looks like it's going to continue to go up into the next month and peak out at around 6%. It does level off then, but really doesn't go down that much. So it's enduring at least 6 months of very heavy turnover. That's something I need to address. So what I'll do is move down away from this individual summary of the graph and move to my summary data. And what this is going to do is tell me what are some of the factors and that go into turnover and are the results of turnover. What are the average salaries I'm paying? What's the breakdown in turnover, high performer versus non-high performer? And then even data such as, if you put in a factor as to, what turnover costs you in dollars, what's the financial effect of turnover? So what I can do at this point is maybe do a little bit of modeling, and it'll incorporate that past data that I showed that we used to combat this earlier. So if I start my modeling, it'll highlight and make live these future months of things that I can actually affect, that I can actually change, that might have an effect on turnover. So right now, you see in February, the average salary is $137. So I must be losing some high-paying people, which are high-paid people, which are likely my higher performers, and the average salary is ticked down a little bit. Overall turnover is pretty high at 6%. What if I go ahead and increase that to by 5,000 and make my average salary 140,000? Turnover really didn't go down that much. It went down about 0.2%, and that's not overly surprising when I look back and see that I'm paying close to industry standards as far as compensation. So maybe that's not the factor that's driving people away, so maybe I won't make the investment there. It looks like the telecommuting policy that we put into place 2 years ago is pretty popular. We've got almost a third of our employees that we're letting work from home. What if I increase that again, maybe bring it up to 45%, which is a lot of people working from home? That actually does. That brings the total turnover down by about 1.5 points. And you can see it starts to ebb down into the future. However, it doesn't really address that high performer turnover. So if I go in and do a little drill down on the graph as well, it'll show me that, yeah, it's really the non-high performers who tend to like working from home. The high performers, it's ebbed that a little bit, but that's a lot of my best brain power or productivity going out of the company. So what can I do to affect that? Well, even though I instituted a career training, it looks like my managers have been very stingy in letting people into it. We have less than 5% of our population is actually doing any type of career training. So perhaps I can put some forceful measures in place that will push more people into more high performers into that program. So if I can get that up to, say, 15%, that has a massive effect on my high performer turnover, reduces it by 2/3. And you can see that that trend will continue going forward. And that's really what I'm looking for, is some way to, reduce the high performer turnover and keep those, most productive employees at the company. So that's probably the best use of my investment, as opposed to giving salary increases. And you can decide, what is the remote employees, if you want to keep that, or just, put that back to what it was, and you're okay with maybe some of those non-high performers leaving the company. So all in all, this is, we looked at different ways of mining big data in your in a people analytics solution, both external data and internal data, and showing that you can deal with a large population. Now, right now, this is the kind of out-of-the-box version of the TrenData people analytics solution. We have 18 metrics that we've built. We did a survey of 40,000 HR executives about 18 months ago to find out what are the top 10 metrics they need. And out of that, we came out of these 18 metrics. But we know there are other metrics that individual companies want to track. Some companies have as many as 100, 150 workforce metrics. So right now, with only 18, it's pretty easy to move around to find the metric you're looking for. As you saw, we have pretty much a two-step interface where 2 clicks, you're where you want. But if you have a lot more metrics, that might be difficult to move around. So we put in a natural language search here, which will allow you to, if you have a lot of metrics, to go through the system and maybe find the metric more in a Google-like search that addresses what you're looking for. So if I type in best source of hire, it doesn't have to go really that far with only 18 metrics, but it'll bring up the top source of hire metric that I want to look at, and it'll launch me right into it. Now, what we're working on, one of our, hopefully to be out in the next 60 days, is if you have the data in your system and you search for a metric that is not in the system, but you have the data to build it, like for example, you have last year's salary and this year's salary, and you said, what was the average raise last year? The system will give you the ability to actually construct that metric on the fly and build all the associated analytics with it. So some fun stuff coming out in the future, but this is right now the natural search will work very well within the system. So go back to the presentation here real quick. We're getting towards the end of the presentation. I want to make sure I left enough room for questions. So at this point, I'll ask Steve if he's received any questions, and also open it up. If you have a question, just chat it in. But Steve, had we had any during the presentation of people who've asked anything?
We did get a few. And so the first one was, can you incorporate multiple salary or comp surveys into your system?
Yes, we are able to, if you wanted to have a metric that showed your current salary versus 3 different or 4 different others, you can do that as well. Or we could actually help you to aggregate them and maybe take the average of the 3. Yes, but that's definitely possible.
Okay. Next one we got here was, can you calculate an engagement metric from SurveyMonkey data?
Yes. Again, the system is very easy to incorporate data. We're actually kind of evaluating that ourselves if we want to put an employee engagement survey tool actually inside our solution. But right now, yes, that's what we would do. We would rely on an outside, allow you to integrate with an outside survey engine, and then we can take that data and produce a metric very similar to the ones that you saw on the screen. Yes.
Okay. We have one more, and I actually answered it on the fly, but I guess for the rest of the group, we'll point it out. It was, can one of your data sources be our financial systems?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, and that's the key part of it, being able to bring in financial data into the system. We actually, and I didn't show this during the demonstration, actually have a financial grid where if you want to manually enter your company's revenues, profits, or whatever, it can calculate those various grids. But yeah, of course, optimally, you'd want to bring the data real time in from your finance system to be able to do those comparisons and justifications versus real-time revenue. Absolutely.
Okay. And then we have 2 more here, and they kind of tie together, so I'll ask them at the same time. Okay. One is, how many years of data do you recommend for the predictions to be valid? And then the second one is, what are you using to determine the future predictive?
Yeah, all good questions. So as far as how many years you'd be looking, we found above 5 is you can really start to get good data. Now, what kind of ties into that other question is the more factors you have, the more accurate the predictions can be. We have predictive models that can go basically just off of tenure, age, and salary and give you somewhat of a prediction of things like retention and stuff. But, if you can drop in performance, commute distance, industry benchmarks, and other things into that, then that data becomes a lot more strong. And when we do a predictive scenario, generally what we do is we engage one of our data scientists who will actually speak with the client and try and get not only what comes out of their past information, but also help you to put in those events in the past information, so give you that ability for analysis, but also any things that might not necessarily be contained in the data. Things like, are you a seasonal company? Does do you do a lot of hire and firing in the holidays versus such, or are you anticipating certain events coming up that wouldn't necessarily have been included in historic data? So it's probably about, it's about 80% pulling what you have in the data and a little bit of interviewing on our part to find out a little better feel for your business. But, absolutely, the more factors and the more history, the better. But we can construct from something very basic. Is that it?
Yep, that's all we have here in the chat windows. Okay,
fantastic. I do want to let everybody know before they go that we do this as a monthly webinar series. But if you go to our website and go to the resources tab, you can actually view our prior webinars. We'll have this one up in a recorded fashion as well. But you can go listen to recordings of our prior webinars. And as I said, this one we should have up in about 2 or 3 days. Usually it takes us that long to take the recording, and put it in the right format to go on the website. And we will be doing another webinar next month, so keep checking our events page for what's coming. And I do want to make anybody on the call aware that we do offer a free 30-day trial of our solution. So if you want to look at your data inside our solution, we can help you formulate a file that can be uploaded into the system. And usually it takes us, a couple hours to do that. It won't give you the predictive piece, but it'll give you the drill down, the analytics, the events overlay, and everything else in the system to kind of at least visualize and see your data and get some initial insights from it where you can start making some decisions without really paying a dime out of your pocket for 30 days. We don't ask you to sign a contract. We provide you free full support during that time period, which includes helping you set up the file import. So if you're interested in that, just send us an email at marketing@trendata.com or send a chat to Steve while we're online here, and he can handle it as well. If you do the marketing, include that promo code. You don't necessarily have to, but that helps us track where the source of the trial came from. So I think at that point, that's all we had. I would like to thank everybody for attending. I hope it was beneficial for you, and reach out to us if we can do anything else for you, and I hope to see you on future webinars and TrenData events. Thank you very much.